Joshua chapters 23 and 24, the closure of the book of Joshua. Interestingly enough, the book of Joshua concludes with not one, but two farewell speeches by the central character by Joshua, the first in chapter 23, followed by another in chapter 24. This, of course, raises the obvious question, why two? What is the difference between the two? And we will get to that when comparing the two speeches. But for starters, the first interesting point is the actual closure of the book with speeches, because this actually creates an inclusio, a framework which connects with the opening chapter, because as we recall, the book of Joshua also opens in chapter 1 with speeches by God to Joshua and by Joshua to the people, to the 2.5 tribes in the east. And we will see that this enclosure, this framework, is not only in the aspect of the style of speech, oratory speeches, but actually also relates somewhat to the content of the speeches as well. The nature of these speeches has been viewed by scholars as pertaining, at least one of them in the closure of the book, pertaining to the Deuteronomy school. And we can definitely see many shared phrases, words between what we find in Deuteronomy and in these speeches. And hence, this is one of the cornerstones of biblical research, modern biblical research, and the thesis that there was a Deuteronomy school which played a part in the redaction of the books, and these speeches were often placed in pivotal points and pervade and advanced the outlook of this school of Deuteronomy, with particular emphasis on the love of God. So we definitely can see it here in the framework of the book of Joshua, beginning and end of the book. So we will begin with chapter 23, the first farewell speech by Joshua. And it was after many days, after the Lord had given rest to Israel from all their enemies round about, and Joshua was old and come along in years. The mention of Joshua's being old reminds us of what was already stated earlier on in the opening of chapter 13. There too, it was mentioned that now Joshua was old, advanced in years, and then he was commanded to begin allotting the land. And that has led many scholars to suggest, as we already stated, that chapters 13 till 21 till the end of the book were a later addition. Originally, they didn't exist, and they were inserted between the two mentions of Joshua's being old. In any event, we return to the closure here, chapter 23, once again mentioning Joshua's being old. And we're, of course, very curious to know, what will Joshua have to say in his farewell speeches? We've seen farewell speeches previously in the Bible. They've always been very important. We saw what, for example, Jacob told the sons on his deathbed. We know Moses spoke to the people, right, in his final days. And all these speeches are pivotal. What will Joshua have to tell the people? What will concern Joshua in his final days and in his final messages to his people, the people of Israel? To understand Joshua's concerns, we have to remember, on the one hand, that Joshua as a military leader was very successful and was able to conquer the land and bring it under the control of the Israelites. And indeed, there are descriptions which show a total success of taking over the land and destroying the previous peoples. For an example, we can see in Joshua chapter 11, the conclusion and summary of his conquests. There was not a city that made peace with the children of Israel, save the Hivites, the inhabitants of Givon. They took all in battle, for it was from the Lord to harden their hearts, that they should come against Israel in battle, that they might destroy them completely, and that they might have no favor, that they might destroy them as the Lord had commanded Moses. And indeed, in the end, we see a summary, and Joshua took the whole land according to all that the Lord had spoken to Moses, and Joshua gave it for an inheritance to Israel according to their divisions by their tribes, and the land rested for more. So here we have this very positive, all-encompassing success story of uprooting the previous inhabitants and taking control of the land. However, on the flip side, there are also counter-evaluations. For example, if we return to Joshua chapter 13, after mentioning that Joshua was old, and the Lord said to him, "You are old and advanced in years, and there remains yet very much land to be possessed." And then there's a summary of the land that has not been conquered. This is the land that yet remains, all the borders of the Philistines and all the Geshurites, from the Shihor, which is before Egypt, to the borders of Ekron, northward. All right, continue with the Philistines and different cities of the Philistines, from the south, in the land of the Canaanites, and the Gibeonites, and the Lebanon, the north. There are many areas that were not conquered. All the inhabitants of the hill country, from Lebanon to Misrefot Maim, and all the Sidonians, I will drive them out from before the children of Israel, as a future promise, only divide it by lot to the Israelites for an inheritance as I have commanded you. So here in chapter 13, we see that the conquest was not a total conquest. There still remained many peoples in the land in which the Israelites came to control. And indeed, some scholars have viewed this as being an inherent contradiction and have stipulated that there may have been different sources behind the different evaluations. Was there a total success, or were there still peoples who were not conquered? I don't think it is absolutely necessary to view this as emanating from different sources. It could be we can relate to these two seemingly conflicting evaluations in the following way. On the one hand, there's a general taking over of the land, which was a big success. Joshua indeed managed to take control and have the Israelites become the dominant force within the land. So on the whole, there is a total success, and Israel controls the borders in general. However, within these borders, there are different towns and villages, and there are still areas that were inhabited by the previous dwellers of the land. And from that perspective, the conquest was not a total conquest. So on a general level, one can see a total conquest, but there were still little pools of foreign or original inhabitants there that the Israelites had not managed to kick out of the land. And this reality, I think, plays as the backdrop and central issue that Joshua raises in his speech, as we shall see. That Joshua called all of Israel, their elders and their heads and their judges and their officers, and he said to them, I am old and come along in years. And we can see now, what we'll see is this speech is actually constructed by different reviews of what God has done for the Israelites, particularly as far as conquering the land and fulfilling all his promises. And with each of these different surveys, if you will, and historical surveys, then there are also exhortations on the part of Joshua towards the Israelites. So the first survey review, historical review, is in verses 3 to 5, as we shall see. And you have seen, after he calls all the leaders of the Israelites, he starts recapping what has happened. And you have seen all that the Lord your God has done to all these nations before you. For the Lord your God, it is he that has fought for you. Behold, I have allotted to you for an inheritance to your tribes, these nations that remain from the Jordan, with all the nations that I have cut off to the great sea towards the setting of the sun. So Joshua states that he has allotted the land to the tribes, and there still remains, right, nations. Notice that term, Hagoyim, these nations that remain from the Jordan, with all the nations that I've cut off. There's still others that remain, right, beyond the Jordan River, right? And the Lord your God, he shall push them out from before you and drive them out from before you, and you will inherit their land as the Lord your God has spoken to you. So here's a summary of what has happened. Joshua tells the leaders, God has fulfilled what he has promised. He has fought for you, and you have inherited the land. And within this inheritance, there are also other nations as well that remain. And as we can see shortly, this is one of the concerns. And you shall be very resolute to keep and do all that is written in the book of the Torah of Moses, so that you do not turn from it right or left. This verse should resonate with all those who have been following our read of the book of Joshua. This verse in which Joshua exhorts that you have to be resolute in keeping the Torah and not vying left or right is very reminiscent of what God tells Joshua in the opening chapter of the book. Just be strong and very courageous to observe and to do in accordance with all of the Torah that Moses, my servant, has commanded you. Do not stray therefrom right or left, in order that you succeed wherever you go. This book of the Torah shall not leave your mouth. You shall meditate therein day and night, in order that you observe to do all that is written in it. For then will you succeed in all your ways, and then will you prosper. So we see the similarity. But what's interesting is in chapter 1, it is God who is exhorting Joshua to follow the Torah, not stray from the Torah left or right. Whereas in our chapter, those very same words seem to now be in the mouth of Joshua himself, speaking to the people. And I think this is, of course, indicative of the stage we are at. For if in the beginning the major concern was the success of Joshua as leader to bring the people and fulfill, right, the destiny to inherit the land, in this stage, after Joshua has completed what was imposed upon him, now the concern is about the future. And hence it is Joshua who is telling the people that your success is dependent upon your being resolute in keeping to the Torah of Moses, so that you do not come among these nations that remain with you, nor shall you make mention of the names of their deities, nor exact oaths by their names, and you shall not serve them nor bow to them, but cling to the Lord your God as you have done to this day. So here we have the first exhortation. We can see the concern. Joshua is concerned, since there are still peoples that remain that will be pushed out only in the future, shall push them out from before you, as we read in verse 5. Now, the major concern of Joshua is their intermingling, if you will, their assimilation into those remaining peoples in the land. And how will this be averted? What is the remedy for this danger? Being resolute in keeping to the Torah, so that they don't come right among these nations, right, intermingle with these nations, and thereby also absorb their beliefs, their deities as well. Their mission is to cling to the Lord. And let's remember that word, cling to the Lord your God, right? That's a translation of the Hebrew tidbaku, lidvok, to cling to, right? The way to overcome the concern of assimilation is by clinging to God, by being totally committed to the Torah of Moses. So that's the first exhortation, which followed the first historical summary of what God has done. Now we see the concern and exhortation of Joshua to keep the Torah so that they don't mingle and assimilate into the nations. Now we continue with the second summary, historical summary, which we will find in verses 9 and 10. And the Lord has driven out from before you great and mighty nations. As for you, no man has stood before you to this day. One man of you pursued 1,000. For it is the Lord your God who wages war for you, and he has spoken as he has spoken to you. So once again, we see Joshua emphasizing how God fulfilled all his promises, fought for you, and how you have been successful, right, in an extraordinary way in driving out your enemies. Now we get to, following that second survey, we get to the second exhortation, which we will read in verses 11 to 13. Take good heed to yourselves, to love the Lord your God. And here we see the emphasis of love, very characteristic of Deuteronomic language, le'ahava et Hashem, emphasized in the book of Deuteronomy and also in the continual speeches found in what is viewed as the Deuteronomic historians' contribution to these books. For if you turn away and cling to the remnant of these nations, now notice the word again, cling, right? If you don't cling to your God, as we saw beforehand, right? But cling to your God in verse 8. But rather, instead of clinging to your God, rather you will cling to the remnant of these nations that remain with you and intermarry with them and mingle with them, and they with you. Know of a certainty that the Lord your God will not drive these nations out from before you anymore, and they will be a snare and an obstacle to you, and a goad in your sides, and thorns in your eyes. Once again, reminding us of verses in the Torah, warning us of intermingling with the nations, until you perish from this good land, which the Lord your God has given you. So here we see another exhortation and warning, right, to turn away and not cling, and a warning of what will happen if you do cling to the remnant of these nations, that the Lord will drive you out just as he drove out those nations. Because if you intermarry with these nations, aren't like them, you will suffer the same fate as those very nations that you're driving out now. So that's stage 2. We had another survey of how God fought, and now flipping over after God has shown his commitment to you. Now Joshua exhorts you have to show your commitment to God, and in this instance, there's even a warning that if you don't, you will be driven out of the land. And this brings us in verse 14 to a kind of a second opening, which will begin again with the mention of Joshua's age and another short, succinct description of what God has done. And then we will enter that third exhortation of Joshua. So, once again, Joshua emphasizes, and behold, this day I am going the way of all the earth. In other words, I'm old and I will soon die. And you shall know with all your hearts and with all your souls, also once again, very characteristic of Deuteronomic language, that not one thing of all the good things that the Lord your God has spoken concerning you has failed. all have happened to you. Not one word of it has failed. Very positive evaluation and summary of God standing up to all his promises. And now the final and third exhortation in this chapter. And it shall be that as all the good things that the Lord your God has spoken to you have come to pass, so shall the Lord bring upon you all the evil things until he has destroyed you from this good land that the Lord your God has given you. And see the contrast, right, between the emphasis of the good land, the word tovah, good land, contrasted with all the evil things, the ra that will come upon you, the evil things until he has destroyed you. Very forceful and ominous language that the Israelites, if they turn their backs against the Lord, then just as all the good has come about, so too all these exhortations and warnings will also come about, because God lives up to what he says. When you transgress the covenant of the Lord your God that he has commanded you, and you will go and serve strange gods, and you will bow to them, then the wrath of the Lord will burn against you, and you will perish quickly from upon the good land that he has given you. And here is that third exhortation, which is actually mostly a warning, a threat, right? If we began with the first historical summary, which was followed by an exhortation to follow the Lord and follow the Torah of Moses, we see an escalation in the different exhortations, where the second one focuses on warning against intermingling with the nations and us suffering the fate, the Israelites suffering the fate of those nations that were kicked out if you will intermingle with them. And finally, we see the harshest of exhortations in the third level, after the short summary, the ominous warning of ultimate expulsion from the land for breaking the covenant. So if we summarize, what we see here is basically Joshua being very concerned about the future challenges, religious challenges, and I would say even social religious challenges facing the Israelites when they still have to live with other nations that were left that are idolaters, and the warnings against intermingling with them and assimilating with them, with the remedy being the emphasis of clinging to God and being devoted to keeping the Torah in the strongest of ways. And I think that what we see in verse 6 perhaps is the focus, right? וחיזקתם מאוד לשמור ולעשות את כל הכתוב בספר תורת משה. And you shall be very resolute, very strong to keep and do all that is written in the book of the Torah of Moses. That term, v'chizaktem, chazak ve'ematz, right? Be here translated resolute, to be very forceful and strong in keeping the Torah, right? As of course reminiscent of what we saw in the first chapter, chazak ve'ematz, be strong and courageous. So here, now it is Joshua who is concerned about the future now, that is very much encouraging and exhorting the Israelites to be strong and faithful to their God and their keeping of the Torah, and warning them about the dangers of assimilation. So it's clear that in this chapter, in the speech, one of the first of the farewell speeches of Joshua to the people, it summarizes, on the one hand, the success of the conquest and emphasizing how God has fulfilled all that he has promised to the Israelites, and then exhorting upon the Israelites to keep their part now and evince their commitment and clinging to God, just as he has kept his part. So we can view this very much as a summary of the conquest. After all the success and the inheriting of the land, now there is the perspective into the future of some of the dangers that spiritual dangers that will face the Israelites when they are dwelling in the land with other idolaters that still remain there. That is, I believe, the essence of Joshua's farewell speech in chapter 23, which, like we said, was broken down into kind of 3 takes, every time with a summary of God's fulfillment of all that he has promised, and then exhortations for the Israelites with a escalating kind of warning about what will happen if they don't keep their part. And this brings us to the closing chapter of the book, Joshua chapter 24. Surprisingly, like we said, there's not one farewell speech, but rather 2. And of course, we're very curious to understand and find out, why is there a second speech, and how is this second speech in comparison to the first one in chapter 23? We'll see some similar aspects, particularly from a structural perspective. We'll see also that kind of threefold division and gradual escalation as well in this speech, but we'll see a somewhat different focus. Some of these verses are very well known because they are also part of the ritual, the Haggadah, that is read on Passover. Verses from this, because there is a historical survey, as we shall see, that Joshua presents in his closing speech in chapter 24. So let us begin. And Joshua gathered all the tribes of Israel to Shechem. This time the location is emphasized. The previous chapter, we did not know exactly where it took place. It was just stated that Joshua called all of the Israelites and invited them, and perhaps we would think that is taking place still in Shiloh as a possibility, but here it explicitly stated that the event takes place in Shechem once again. Of course, that reminds us of the covenant that was made in Shechem earlier on, following the conquest of Jericho and the Ai in chapter 8. So he calls once again, like previously, the heads, the leaders of the Israelites, to come before God, and maybe that hints that before God, the tabernacle, the Mishkan, was now in Shechem, possibly. And Joshua said to the whole nation, "Thus said the Lord God of Israel, your fathers dwelt on the other side of the river from earliest time, Terach, the father of Abraham, and the father of Nahor, and they served other gods." Interestingly enough, and this is the famous verse that is also found in the Haggadah of Pesach and Passover, stating, going back to the beginnings of Israelite history with the founding fathers, the father of the founding father, Terach, who came from beyond the river, right? And who was an idolater, who served other gods. And I took your father Abraham from the other side of the river and led him throughout all the land of Canaan and multiplied his seed and gave him Isaac. And I gave Isaac Jacob and Esau. And I gave to Esau Mount Seir to inherit it, and Jacob and his children went down into Egypt. And I sent Moses and Aaron, and I plagued the Egyptians according to that which I did in their midst. And afterwards I brought you out. And I brought your fathers out of Egypt, and you came to the sea, and the Egyptians pursued your fathers with chariots and horsemen to the Red Sea. And they cried to the Lord, and he put darkness between you and the Egyptians, and brought the sea upon him, and it covered him. Reminding us of the splitting of the Red Sea and the drowning of the Egyptian army. The darkness reminds us of the cloud that moved in the night. And your eyes have seen what I have done in Egypt, and you sojourned in the wilderness many days. And I brought you to the land of the Amorites who dwelt on the other side of the Jordan, and they waged war with you, and I delivered them into your hand, and you inherited their land, and I destroyed them before you. Right? The victories in the time of Moses on the east of the river, the Jordan River. Then Balak, the son of Zippor, king of Moab, arose and warred against Israel. And he sent and called Balaam, the son of Beor, to curse you. And I did not want to hearken to Balaam, and he blessed you. So I delivered you out of his hand. And you crossed the Jordan and came to Jericho. And the inhabitants of Jericho fought against you. The Amorites and the Perizzites and the Canaanites and the Hittites and the Girgashites, the Hivites and the Jebusites. And I delivered them into your hand. This, of course, not explicitly mentioned in the account of the conquest of Jericho, but we can assume after the walls fell, the Israelites stormed in there and had to fight against the inhabitants, and perhaps there was a collection of different peoples there. And I sent the hornet before you, and it drove them out from before you, even the two kings of the Amorites, not with sword nor with your bow. This mention of the hornet is also found in the Torah. We have a lot of verses that return to issues raised in the Torah. Some scholars have claimed that the hornet may be a hidden reference to the Egyptians who had in their insignia kind of these insects, right? In the coins, the Egyptian coins, it was a sign of the Egyptian Empire. So it could be a hint that the Egyptians who controlled much of Canaan at that time, they were able to drive out many of the existing nations, and it wasn't even left to the hands of the Israelites to do so. And I've given you a land for which you did not labor, and cities which you did not build, and you have settled in them. Of the vineyards and olive yards which you did not plant, you eat. So here we have seen an extended historical survey going back to the very beginnings of the history of the Jewish people, with Terach, the father of Abraham, following through with Jacob, and going down to Egypt and everything that happened with the Exodus from Egypt, how God sent Moses and Aaron to bring them out, with the miracles taking place as they left Egypt, and then overcoming the Amorites who lived in the land of Israel and the different nations that were there. That was the succinct overview of Israelite history, if you will. Why is Joshua doing this? Why is he mentioning and even going back to the very beginnings and saying that Terach worshipped idols and they were in Egypt and they overcame the nations in Canaan? Let's find out. Verse 14. And now fear the Lord and serve him in sincerity and in truth, and remove the gods which your fathers served on the other side of the river and in Egypt, and serve the Lord. Now things start to clarify. For in this verse, we move from the historical summary to a kind of challenge, an exhortation to the Israelites, the first that we will find. We'll see there will be others. And this time there is the demand that they get rid of all their idols. From here we can see that there were still aspects of idolatry, and Joshua is telling them to fear the Lord, and that means to serve him in totality and sincerity and in truth, and that requires that they get rid of the other gods, right? And these other gods were the gods that were worshipped by your fathers on the other side of the river and in Egypt. Notice the mention of these two. The other side of the river, that refers to the other side of the Jordan River, namely towards Mesopotamia to the east, and in Egypt. And of course, these were two parts of these of the historical survey, how your fathers were from beyond the river and worshipped other gods, and so too were your more immediate previous generations who were in Egypt and served other gods. And now we understand how the survey connects with what Joshua wants to get to. He's not just teaching a lesson in history. He's telling them, well, your founding fathers and previous generations did worship idols, but they were taken out of those lands. Now you've reached the promised land and you're demanded to get rid of those foreign idols, right, that you have, which were served by your fathers when before they entered the land, when they were either in Mesopotamia or in Egypt. And then he continues on and says, and if it displeases you to serve the Lord, choose this day whom you will serve, whether the gods which your fathers served that were on the other side of the river, or the gods of the Amorites in whose land you dwell. But as for me and my household, we shall serve the Lord. So now Joshua tells them, you have to choose, right? And here he mentions also that third geographic component. He mentioned beyond the river and Egypt. Now he also mentioned the foreign gods within the land, right, that were worshipped by the Amorites, right, the gods of the Amorites in whose land you dwell, right? So you have to make a decision between those foreign gods or worshiping God. If you do not want to, you want to continue with the foreign gods, you can. As for me and my household, we shall serve the Lord. So here we have a survey, a historical survey with the different lands. And then the point being, well, those different lands had their own gods, their foreign gods. Now you have to make a decision. I want to worship God. You also have to make a decision what you will do. Let's see the response of the people. And the nation answered and said, God forbid that we should forsake the Lord to serve other gods. For the Lord our God, it is he who brought us and our fathers up from the land of Egypt, from the house of bondage, and who performed these great signs in our sight, and preserved us in all the way that we went, and among all the people through whom we passed. And the Lord drove out all the nations, and the Amorites who dwell in the land from before us. We too shall serve the Lord, for he is our God. So the people basically absorb the message, and they understand God has brought them out from bondage and has helped them and secured them in all the vicissitudes and all their challenges facing other nations. And now they will be faithful to God, just as Joshua says he wants. Okay, so it seems like everything is done. Joshua was successful, and the people have said, we will serve God as well, just as you want, right? And that, of course, entails getting rid of their foreign idols. Surprisingly, Joshua doesn't stop and is not satisfied. And this is very striking. I'd even say quite unique and surprising. And Joshua said to the people, you will not be able to serve the Lord, for he is a holy God. He is a jealous God. He will not forgive your transgressions or your sins. When you forsake the Lord and serve strange gods, then he will turn and do you evil and destroy you after he has done you good. Again, we see the contrast between all the good that God has done and the evil that he will do. So Joshua basically says, okay, you want to serve God. You can't do it. You will not be able to do it. Why? Because you have to understand, this is not any God. This is just not another God. This God is a God that is holy, and he is a jealous God, right? He doesn't tolerate having other sidekicks with him, right? And you cannot serve him because it's going to be too dangerous for you. You're dealing with a holy and jealous God, and if you forsake him, then you will be destroyed, and therefore this is not for you. You're too much on the side of mingling with other gods, right? Synchronous kind of worship with syncretism, blending two beliefs together. This is not acceptable in this God's eyes. He is a holy and jealous God. So basically, Joshua turns him down and says, it's not for you. Forget it. Surprisingly. And the people said to Joshua, no, but we will serve the Lord. So here we have, after that kind of second challenge and warning, again, a response by the people. No, we will serve the Lord. We understand we will serve the Lord and only the Lord. No, we want to do it. We will serve the Lord. Okay, so even though Joshua said it's not for you, the people emphasized, yes, we want to serve the Lord. Third take, and Joshua said to the people, you are witnesses against yourself that you have chosen the Lord for yourselves to serve him. And they said, we are witnesses. And now remove the strange gods which are among you and incline your heart to the Lord God of Israel. So now Joshua says, listen, I told you it's not for you, but you said you wanted it. You are witnesses to yourselves. There can't be any future doubts about the fact that you took it upon yourselves to worship this God. And I warned you, he is a jealous God. He is a holy God. He doesn't tolerate syncretism and other worship, foreign worship. And therefore, you're choosing to go in and play, you're playing with fire, playing with the dangers of this God. You've chosen it yourselves. You're witnesses to your own decisions. And once again, he says, you have to remove those strange gods which are among you, and then incline your hearts to the worship of God. The response to this third exhortation on the part of Joshua, and the people said to Joshua, the Lord our God we shall serve. Notice now the sentence structure, emphasizing first bringing God to the beginning of the sentence, right? Not that we shall serve God, no. The Lord our God we shall serve. The Hebrew, et Hashem Eloheinu na'avod, right? The Lord our God we shall serve, and his voice we shall hearken, vekolo nishma. We have here, right, a higher form of commitment on the part of the Israelites that they will serve and they will also listen and hearken to the voice of God. So here what we have found in this speech basically concludes here, is like three descriptions of or challenges that Joshua presents to the people. Get rid of your foreign gods. It's not for you. It's beyond your capacity. This is a dangerous God. And then, okay, you are witnesses that you've taken it upon yourselves. Fascinating speech, quite unique. I'm not familiar with anything else like it in the Bible, in which, I mean, there's some aspects you could find in different places, but in such scope where Joshua's basically saying, it's not for you, you can't do it. What's going on here? We have a totally different kind of rhetoric, which we're not familiar with from the Bible usually, where the leader, in this case the prophet Joshua, is basically telling them not to worship God because he's too holy and too jealous and it's too dangerous and it's not for you. What's behind this rhetoric? So for one, first of all, just to appreciate the psychology here, it's kind of a negative psychology being used by Joshua. So far, he's been telling them to worship, to be strong and committed to Torah. Here he's basically saying, this is not for you. Don't do it. You can't, you're not going to be able to uphold it. You're not going to live up to it. And it's too dangerous for you. To a certain extent, there's a negative psychology being used, right? Sometimes when you encourage and implore people to do things, well, they're a little heavy and less willing. But if you tell them not to do it, it's not for you, it's too hard, then sometimes they actually are more motivated on their part to try to do it. Sometimes it's, it's in a surprisingly paradoxical way. When you tell a kid, okay, I want you to learn Torah, right? Come and learn the words of God. "Oh, I don't feel like it, not now." But if you approach them sometimes and say, you can't learn now. This is not for you. We're learning something very special, very holy. Maybe it's suitable for me and my house, and maybe for this specific person. This is not for you. This is something really unique. Just don't try. It's not for you. Oh, that's when people start getting interested and they want to. What Joshua wanted to accomplish here, in my mind, is um, is that the people from within their own initiative take upon themselves this commitment to God, to worshiping God and God alone, and not worshiping other gods. And the way that he accomplishes this is by using reverse psychology of telling them, no, you can't do it, so that they say, we want to do it. And once he gets them, you are witnesses to yourselves. You have taken it upon yourselves. You know that this is a God who is holy and who is a jealous God. You know the dangers, but you have chosen to do this out of your own volition. You have said this. You have asked for it, right? And I think this is the unique power of this speech. From here on in the chapter, we have a description of actions taken by Joshua, and this is also very interesting. We read, verse 25, and Joshua made a covenant with the people that day and set them a statute and an ordinance in Shechem. So the covenant again being made in Shechem sounds familiar, of course. We've already had a covenant earlier on in the book of Joshua after the conquest of Jericho and Ai in Shechem. And once again, Joshua was making a covenant in the end of his days in Shechem, which obviously played a very central role in the early times of the conquest, the time of Joshua. And Joshua wrote these words in the book of the law of God. And so we have here a mention of writing in the book of the law of God. This is something which is reminiscent of language found also only in the book of Nehemiah, later on, Ezra and Nehemiah. What does it refer to? Well, we don't have any components in the Torah and the Pentateuch that are directly connected to this event that Joshua may have written. So apparently there was this other book that was called the Book of the Law of God, which we know of from here, in which Joshua wrote these words, whatever these words included, what the people took upon themselves, or other descriptions of the whole event that were written down in this book of the law of God. And this is part of the covenant, writing down, right, in the book of the law of God, and took a great stone and set it under the doorpost, which is in the sanctuary of the Lord. He also sets up a massive stone. And Joshua said to all the people, behold, this stone shall be a witness against us, for it has heard all the words of the Lord, which he spoke to us. It shall be a witness against you, lest you deny your God. So there's a big, right, rock stone here that is serving as a reminder to the people. It was here. This is where the event took place. It is, if you will, a witness, right, to all that has occurred. And whenever the Israelites will see this stone, they will recall, oh, there was a covenant which was made here in Shechem. So Joshua wrote down the words in a book of the Lord, right? And also sets up a stone that serves as a witness, right? And Joshua sent the people away, every man to his inheritance. So this concluding description of the event here that's in Shechem, I think obviously invites us to compare it to the event that took place in that very same place in Shechem, or earlier in Joshua chapter 8, after the victory over the Ai. So we'll just recap to compare. Then Joshua built an altar to the Lord God of Israel on Mount Ebal. That's also in Shechem. As Moses, servant of the Lord, commanded the children of Israel, as it is written in the book of the law of Moses, an altar of whole stones upon which no man has lifted up any iron. And they offered upon it burnt offerings to the Lord and sacrificed peace offerings. And he wrote there upon the stones a copy of the law of Moses, which he wrote in the presence of the children of Israel. And all Israel and their elders and officers and their judges, similar description of those who were invited by Joshua, stood on this side of the ark and on that side before the priests, the Levites, the bearers of the ark of the covenant of the Lord, the stranger as well as the native born. And then there's the whole ceremony in between the two mountains, the blessing and of the nation and the curse. And afterwards, he read all the words of the law, the blessing and the curse, according to all that is written in the book of the Torah. There was not a word of all that Moses commanded, which Joshua did not read before all the congregation of Israel, with the women and the little ones and the strangers that walked among them. Now, when we compare these two covenant events, the similarities are quite glaring. For starters, of course, we've got location. The geography is the same in both instances. We're talking about a covenant that is made in both cases. We have the mention of the stone or a big stone. Both also have the mention of writing Torah down, right? Writing words down, and we have the mention of the leaders in both instances, the judges, and all the rest of the leaders who are amassed there. So it's quite clear that we have two very similar covenants taking place in the same place in Shechem, right, with Joshua forging the covenant in both instances. Of course, this raises the question, why do we have two covenants here in Shechem? Once in an early stage, right, following the initial conquests of Jericho and the Ai, after they crossed the Jordan, and now the end of Joshua's days before his death, the second covenant in that very same place in Shechem. And here I want to propose a novel explanation. We've seen throughout the book of Joshua, there's an ongoing analogy between Joshua and Moses. Some of the obvious ones are, of course, the crossing of the Jordan paralleling the crossing of the Red Sea, the appearance of the Lord hosts and the command to Joshua to take off his shoes, just as in the burning bush, Moses was commanded to take off his shoes, leading victory, pointing with his weapon until victory, Moses raising his hand until victory. Many different obvious comparisons. The analogy runs throughout the whole book. And I want to propose that the dual covenant that Joshua here performs once in the early stages of his mission and once again in the end of his days is actually very reminiscent of what happened with Moses. Because also in the time of Moses, there were two covenants forged by Moses with the people. Let us remember. We read in Deuteronomy chapter, towards the end, chapter 28, the end of the chapter, about a second covenant that was performed by Moses beyond the original covenant. Here, this is a summary. These are the words of the covenant which the Lord commanded Moses to make with the children of Israel in the land of Moab. This is already when they're on the borders of Israel in the east of the Jordan River in the land of Moab. Notice, besides the covenant which he made with them in Horeb. Horeb referring to Mount Sinai. So also with Moses, there was the original covenant in Mount Sinai, Horeb, and then there was a second covenant later on, towards the end of his days, in the land of Moab, Arvot Moab. The difference between the two is also emphasized. For example, here we read in Deuteronomy chapter 29 about the second covenant. But not only with you am I making this covenant and this oath, but with those standing here with us today before the Lord our God, and also with those who are not here with us this day. In other words, this is a long-term second covenant, right? Apparently from here, we can infer that the first covenant was at Mount Sinai, was focused on the experience of those standing at Mount Sinai. And therefore, it was a covenant with the people, with that generation who were before Sinai. But it was an experiential covenant where they see the appearance of the Lord upon the mountain. This is an experience, right, which was shared by that generation who were standing there under the mountain. But now Moses says, well, there's a need for a second covenant, which is not going to be an experiential covenant, but it's a covenant of words that Moses, right, teaches the people. And it's less of an experience, a high and unique, right, exhilarating experience of seeing God, but rather it is an experience of Moses giving the words, which are to be taught from generation to generation. It's an eternal kind of a covenant. So Moses made two covenants, one early and one later on towards the end of his days. And interestingly enough, we find something similar with Joshua, making the initial covenant, which was very parallel to Mount Sinai, because remember, Joshua wrote in the covenant in Shechem, right? Joshua built an altar just like Moses built an altar next to Mount Sinai, and he wrote upon the stones a copy of the law of Moses, right? That's in chapter 8, verse 32. And of course, that's reminiscent of how Moses wrote on the tablets, right, writing on the rocks. So we have the first covenant of Joshua in chapter 8, and then we have a second covenant, which may parallel the covenant at the end of the days of Moses, which is directed towards future generations, as we saw. The concerns of Joshua as far as the Israelites performing their commitments and being faithful to God. So this may be the final aspect of the analogy between Joshua and Moses, also in the latter covenant of Joshua at the end of his days, paralleling Moses' covenant in the end of his days in Moab, on the borders of Moab. So we return and we'll read the final verses of Joshua chapter 24. So Joshua sent the people away, every man to his inheritance. And it was after these things that Joshua the son of Nun, the servant of the Lord, died, being 110 years old. Here, the book concludes with the death of the central character, Joshua. And note how Joshua here is described. What is his title? Joshua the son of Nun, the servant of the Lord. What is the highest title in the Torah? The highest title in Judaism. Certain cultures, British culture, People even have the title Lord, Lord so-and-so. The highest title conferred upon man in the Torah is very paradoxically that of a servant, servant of the Lord. It is only Moses in the Torah who is called Eved Hashem, servant of the Lord, and now it is Joshua, like Moses, who also earns the highest title to be a servant, servant of the Lord. David doesn't get servant of the Lord, but he's Avdi, my servant. But here that title, servant of the Lord, quite unique title, the highest title you can reach. And it is conferred here in Joshua's death also upon him, just like Moses was considered the servant of the Lord. So Joshua dies at the age of 110 years old. And they buried him in the border of his inheritance in Timnat Serach, which is in Mount Ephraim on the north side of the hill of Gaash. So he's buried there in his inheritance. And interestingly enough, in the Old Greek, there's actually additional text here stating that the Israelites also buried the rocks that Joshua used, the stones that Joshua used to circumcise the Israelites earlier on. An interesting addition found in the Old Greek, kind of comes close circle with the earlier stage of the entrance into the land, the preparation for the entrance and the circumcision of the Israelites by Joshua. And this is mentioned as being buried. The rocks themselves, the stones there that were used, were also buried with Joshua. It doesn't appear in our text, but emphasizes the idea of the covenant and the performance of this covenant by Joshua. And Israel served the Lord all the days of Joshua and all the days of the elders that outlived Joshua and who had known all the works of the Lord that he had done for Israel. All those who were witness to all that God had done, right, remained loyal to God. Of course, this is a premonition that maybe later on things will be more difficult for future generations that have not been witness to that. So Joshua is buried, and we would have thought this would be the end, but there are still a couple of verses. And the bones of Joseph, which the children of Israel had brought up out of Egypt, they buried in Shechem, in the parcel of ground which Jacob bought from the sons of Hamor, the father of Shechem, for 100 pieces of money. And they became the inheritance of the children of Joseph. And here, it's present, we have a mention of the burial of Joseph's bones, which were brought out of Egypt. And not only that, we have the mention also of the priestly leader, and Eleazar, the son of Aaron, died, and they buried him in the hill of Pinchas, his son, which was given to him in Mount Ephraim. Focus on the area of Ephraim and Shechem. The idea of burial sites, of course, very well suits the book of Joshua's emphasis on inheriting the land, for you can inherit via conquest, but another sign of inheritance is, of course, burial sites of your forefathers, and this is, of course, one of the claims that by which the Israelites lay claim to the land via these sites in which their forefathers were buried. So on the one hand, this suits very nicely, right, the whole theme of Joshua of inheriting the land. But I think there's something well beyond that in the mention of the burial, at least of Joseph. We asked the peculiar oddity of having two farewell speeches by Joshua, chapter 23 and chapter 24. In chapter 23, the major concern was fear of assimilation. Because there still remains some of the nations within the land. There's a concern of intermarriage and the effect that it would have upon the people. We can view chapter 23 as perhaps a closure to the book of Joshua, it very well suits the book of Joshua inheriting the land, having other peoples that are still there, and therefore Joshua being concerned and warning the people of the dangers of assimilation and the importance of committing themselves to following the Torah, just as was mentioned in the opening chapter of the book. So one may view chapter 23 as a closure to the book of Joshua. Then what do we do with chapter 24? So here, I think one may view chapter 24 not as a closure of the book of Joshua alone, but rather a closure of the whole Torah with the book of Joshua. And indeed, in modern scholarship, there is the idea of a hexatuch, right? That the Torah, Martin Notha's idea that the Torah may have been with Joshua, as some scholars have proposed. So even if we don't accept and we say the Torah is different because it's the Torah of Moses, but it's clear here that chapter 24 seems to close circle with the Torah. And if we return to the end of the book of Genesis, the first book of the Torah, the book itself summarizes how Joseph dwelt in Egypt, he and his father's household, and Joseph lived 110 years. Interesting enough, 110 years Joseph lives, and so too his descendant, right, Joshua, from the tribe of Ephraim, the chosen son of, leading son of Joseph. He too lives 110 years. Joseph saw children of the third generation born to Ephraim. Also the sons of Machir, the son of Menashe, were born on Joseph's knees. Joseph said to his brothers, I am going to die. God will surely remember you and take you up out of this land to the land that he has swore to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob. And Joseph adjured the children of Israel, made them take an oath, saying, God will surely remember you, and you shall take up my bones out of here. And Joseph died at the age of 110 years, and they embalmed him, and he was placed into the coffin in Egypt. The book of Genesis concludes with Joseph embalmed, right? You can imagine him in like a coffin in a pyramid in Egypt. And he was not buried in Israel. He couldn't, because he also was a central figure in Egyptian culture as the viceroy of Pharaoh. But he knew where his real home was, and he made them take an oath that when you leave this land and God will fulfill his promises to the forefathers, you shall take up my bones out of here. And this is exactly what we read here in the conclusion of Joshua 24. And the bones of Joseph, the children of Israel that brought out of Egypt, were buried. They were brought to burial in the promised land in Shechem, where they are to this day in the site of the burial of Joseph next to Shechem. So we can view chapter 24 as a closure to the whole line of events, starting from Genesis and the promise to the forefathers, right, of a land and its fulfillment here. The Torah, of course, does not conclude with the fulfillment of the promise. Only in the book of Joshua do they cross the Jordan, enter the promised land, and then full circle we see the fulfillment of that oath that the Israelites made to Joseph to bring his bones to burial in the land. It may very well not have been performed at this stage. It was probably performed earlier, but I think it is by no means an accident that the book of Joshua concludes with the mention of the burial of the bones of Joseph, basically fulfilling, all right, the oath and concluding the whole narrative story of the Exodus from Egypt and the arrival into the promised land and the fulfillment of the promise to the forefathers. So hence, proposing that chapter 23 may be a conclusion to the book of Joshua, and chapter 24 may be viewed as a conclusion to the idea of a hexatoch, even if you don't accept it per se, but the idea of the whole chain of events which are recounted from Genesis till Joshua. And with this, we have concluded our study of the book of Joshua.